All right, let's go back to Sandton now. Nompumelelo Siziba is at the Africa Investment Forum. What's the latest, Nompu?
Thanks very much, Desiree. Yes, well, we are still here at the Sandton Convention Centre where we're covering the Africa Investment Forum. Of course, it's the last day today, and a bit later on, we're going to hear the big quantum number. How much have investors pledged to this particular, to the AIF this particular year? Last year, we were advised that some $38.7 billion was committed to various projects across the continent. But without any further ado, I'm joined in our studio here by Mr. Akinwumi Adesina. He's the president of the African Development Bank. Thank you very much, sir, for
It's
joining
good to see you. Thanks for covering the event.
You're very welcome,
Yes.
sir. It's been a pleasure. So, has this year's forum beaten your expectations in terms of the level of interest and the level of participation?
Well, absolutely. First, I want to say I was so delighted His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa was here. And also strong participation and support from the government of South Africa. This is become right now a global platform for anybody that wants to invest in Africa. This year we have a record number of delegates, 2,038 delegates coming from all over the world. You have right here 109 countries that are represented with investors. You've got 1,600 investors from outside of Africa. And the thing that's actually quite interesting out of it is you got 48 African countries, you got 61 non-African countries, all here in Africa, talking about transactions, talking about deals. That is phenomenal. The Africa Investment Forum has become the global platform for investing in Africa, and we are so delighted that it's working out so well.
Of course, there's going to be investor interests across different sectors, but from your analysis so far, which sectors are getting the most attention across the continent?
Oh, and when God created the heavens and the earth, He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so the whole area of energy continues to be the key issue. So energy is the biggest ticket item. Infrastructure, transport, very important. Agriculture, agro-processing is picking up quite a lot. We also see quite a lot of interest in the healthcare sector, in particular pharmaceutical, for example, infrastructure for healthcare. We also see quite a lot of interest as well in private equity funds that are looking to put money together to diversify their portfolio to invest in different sectors in Africa. And I'm also very interested, you'll be very interested to know that there's a lot of interest in financing women businesses. We have a fund here called Alethea Identity Fund.
We spoke to them earlier.
Yeah, exactly. A terrific fund, and that's going on. So these are the critical areas that we are seeing a lot of interest in. And of course, the biggest item here is also going to be a lot in LNG,
yes,
oil and gas industry sometimes, yeah.
In terms of one of the areas that people worry about on the African continent are things like policy certainty. Are we communicating those messages right at a political level about political will to make it easy to do business and invest on the continent?
Well, absolutely. We had the participation of heads of state at this particular forum, and that's very, very unique. When the heads of state come to this forum, they actually don't come with prepared speeches, right? Because everything is done within boardroom conversations. The investors are not used to doing Your Excellency, Our Excellency. They just want to see transactions. So I'm delighted that our heads of state have gotten that particular perspective. They come into the boardrooms, they chair their boardrooms as chief executive officers of their own countries. And that gives a lot of confidence, a lot of assurance to the investors that the policy, the legal, the regulatory environments for their investments to thrive are going to be in place. And it's not just central governments. You also have governors, and you have the premier of Gauteng here, sitting in boardrooms and all of that. That is important to give assurance to the investors. Of course, we have the world of multilateral finance institutions been here, and it's important for us, because we have the instruments to help them to de-risk investments, whether it's political risk, whether it's financial risk, market risk, or project risk. We have those instruments to help them to be able to de-risk all of their projects. And finally, is that we bring to this platform a huge pipeline of quality bankable projects that are actually standardized that will reduce the transaction cost or the search cost of the investors trying to look for bankable projects in Africa. So it's an aggregation point for bankable projects.
And obviously these projects, they're variable, aren't they, in terms of their size, the length of time it will take to complete the investment and so on and so forth. So how do you measure success from one year to the next? Because obviously not all projects will be completed from one year to the next.
No, actually, no, the forum is not an event. It's more than an event. It actually goes on. We have a digital transactional platform that goes on throughout the year. And so, transactions come onto the platform, investors, blast is issued, crowd investors around them, and we try to accelerate closure of financial transactions. And so, for example, I'll give you two good examples of, like this year, we're so excited about is, in South Africa last year, right here, there was a promise made, a transaction called the Accra Sky Train, in which South African investors were going to invest in Accra, for the Sky Train. And this year, we were here, and it's done. They signed a concession agreement in a very, very short period of time for a $2.6 billion transaction. Just yesterday, we did a cocoa board, which is a syndication of $600 million of financing for Ghana's agency for buying cocoa, processing cocoa, exporting cocoa, and so on. With its $600 million, ourselves as multilateral finance institutions for $250 million and $350 million by Credit Suisse. And so it just tells you the kind of speed at which things come together. I like to say, here we promise, here we deliver.
Indeed, I heard your speech. So last year, some $38.7 billion worth of pledges were made in terms of commitment to African projects. This year, what's your estimation? I know you're going to be telling us a little bit later what that key quantum is, how much has been raised, but is it pretty much in line with what you were expecting for this year?
I think we're going to look very good. If you look at the energy in the boardrooms, the number of investors that are here, the range of projects that are being discussed, I think we're going to look really very good. My mom, over Christmas, I always like to keep my gifts. My mom said, open it only on Christmas Day. And so I think we'll know later today.
You'll only open the Christmas gift for us at 3 o'clock this afternoon. One last thing. Is this going to be a continuation that is the event of the Africa Investment Forum every year going forward? And what do you think needs to happen for us to continue the momentum so that come year 5, people don't think, oh, it's that forum again?
No, because this is a very different forum. This is not a conference. This is a 100% transactional forum where deals happen. When was the last time in Africa that you had going into boardroom conversations in anywhere in Africa? This year, $67 billion in conversations around deals. Last year, $48 billion of conversations around deals. And that is what we are doing. The amount of financing gap we have for infrastructure in Africa alone is anything between $68 billion and $108 billion a year.
Yeah.
And so you can either look at that as a problem. I don't. I see that as a massive investment opportunity. And so this forum is basically saying, we're not just going to sit around and be talking deficit, right? We got to talk opportunities. And so how do we package projects? How do we make sure that we get folks to look at Africa as a viable investment destination and help them to change the lenses which they look at Africa? Africa is not looking for aid, you see. Africa is looking for investments. And what this forum will continue to do is to make that case for Africa. Not by talking about it, but actually showing that the bankable deals are there, the transactions can be closed, and we are there on this platform helping investments to land in Africa, like let me say, like a South African airline plane landing on a smooth runway.
And what's beautiful is that it's not just Americans and Europeans and Asian people coming to invest on the continent. It's Africans investing in other African countries.
Absolutely.
As well.
And this is the phenomenal thing about this forum, because Africans themselves don't even understand sometimes the opportunities in other African countries.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the investments that you're actually seeing here is actually by Africans themselves investing in other African countries. If you take, for example, the situation since 2003 to 2019, right? You look at intra-Africa investments, in which case Africans investing in other African countries, it's about $102 billion.
Yeah.
And there are 5 countries that top that. South Africa is probably 40% of that in terms of outbound investments. You got Nigeria, you got Morocco, you got Egypt, and you got Kenya. These are the biggest ones. And so we want to see a lot more, especially given the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that opens up a market, a collective market of $3.3 trillion. So we've got to make sure that Africans can travel to other African countries. We have to make sure that we develop the capital markets to mobilize the savings pool to be able to get companies listed across different stock exchanges. And we have to also make sure that we provide financing. That's what we are doing as African Development Bank to investors in local currency so they can invest in different projects in local currency.
But Mr. Adesina, you know what my problem is that these things that you've mentioned, they're not going to happen overnight, and yet the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is supposed to be kicking off next year. Are we as Africans, are we ready for it? That implies borders opening. We know we've had problems here in South Africa of late around, freedom of movement and, Africans not necessarily trusting each other. Are we ready 12 months, 18 months hence? Are we going to have open borders?
Well, first and foremost, let's see where we've come, right? So you have now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Treaty signed on by 54 African countries. That is phenomenal, right? The African Development Bank, we provided $5 million to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, which is based in Ghana, to start operations. There's a lot of things that actually will make, as you said, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to work. The critical one is infrastructure. Now, look, as African Development Bank, we were not waiting, for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area before we've been investing in all the things we needed. In ports, in rail, the Nakala port, we financed it. You look at the Kasumgula Bridge, we financed that. We are financing a lot of digital infrastructure that will enable digital payments. We're financing massive things on energy, including financing Eskom. Here we put in $4 billion for Eskom. And as I always say, Eskom, in my view, is providing energy not only for South Africa, by the way, for the entire SADC region to move up the manufacturing capacity that the region has. And so we have all the elements in place. It's almost like when you're going to get married, everything is prepared. The priest is ready, the family is ready, and so on. Everybody just kind of say, oh, once the pastor comes up, is this really going to work? But guess what? You're going to see the bride, beautiful, smiling. And I think
that's Nombu Siziba there talking to the president of the African Development Bank about the outcomes of the Africa Investment Forum.